In the year 2020, a pandemic swept through every country, causing mass hysteria and death. And while everyone seemingly lost someone they loved, this pandemic specifically targeted certain groups. The question is why, and how can we prevent this from happening again? The top of the list of casualties to this pandemic were the elderly. The National Library of Medicine had an article stating many factors that they contributed to the high mortality rate among the elderly, and many of these assumed pre-existing diseases and medical problems such as cognitive decline and respiratory symptoms. But others had differing opinions. NBC went on to claim that a contributing factor may have been the actual restrictions to COVID-19 themselves. Another targeted group was obese people.
Obesity is one of the top underlying health conditions associated with COVID-19 deaths.
If you're obese, fat in the abdomen can push on the diaphragm, limiting how much air you take in.
Dr. Gupta says fat cells themselves may also be more susceptible to coronavirus.
While many scientific explanations were given as to why obese people were a target of the pandemic, there were few substantial explanations as to why it targeted other groups. When no medical reasoning could be used to explain why, the media outlets made assumptions based on presumed sociological differences.
The researchers say that African Americans are dying from this virus in such high numbers because of things like access to health care, crowded housing, and discrimination.
Among other groups that were susceptible to the pandemic were Native Americans, people in the northwest of England compared to the southeast, South Asian ethnic immigrants, and those living in the inner cities. Is there a common feature, however, that link all of these groups together? Is there something that the doctors and the media outlets were missing that could have been crucial in saving lives? In 1989 and 1999, there was another highly contagious pandemic that originated in China and spread swiftly throughout Southeast Asia, eventually reaching Panama and the US. By wintertime, it had spread into England, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and then it moved deep into Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central and South Americas. Back then, there were no intensive care units, and there was little government involvement, and the world eventually moved past it, even though it still circulates today as a flu strand. Worldwide, it killed nearly 1 to 4 million people. Since then, medical physicians have been able to determine a common feature among those who are most susceptible to these types of illnesses and pandemics. One of these physicians is Dr. David S. Grimes. He worked in East Lancashire in Blackburn in the UK, and he acquired a lot of knowledge and experience on the immunity of many individuals against the viruses going around. In fact, the knowledge of what separates those that are immune and those who are more prone to viral infections has been around for nearly 50 years, but it was largely ignored by our medical science, governments, and public health officials. Instead, the pandemic became a political weapon to separate those who believed from those who didn't, without much science to back up the social distancing and the masks. So what is the common trait that ties all of the groups targeted by the pandemic together? The answer is vitamin D deficiency. I'm going to borrow some of Dr. Grimes' charts from the British Medical Journal, which have been around since 1974. The body creates a substance called 7-dehydrocholesterol, or 7-DHC, which is an oil on the surface of the skin. When exposed to sunlight, this molecule of 7-DHC is broken at this bond, and this portion here forms vitamin D. This shows the vitamin D levels among people who have been exposed to the sun that are wearing sunscreen versus those who are not wearing sunscreen. For those wearing sunscreen, the UVR, or ultraviolet rays, are absorbed before it ever reaches the skin. Hence, there is a much smaller amount of vitamin D produced in people that wear sunscreen versus those that don't. As you can see here, after the first day of exposure, the body begins to produce melanin, which is a natural sunscreen that then absorbs the UVR that initiates the vitamin D synthesis. So in other words, just like the artificial sunscreen, the natural sunscreen has the same effect and the vitamin D synthesis decreases. Now, the darker your skin or the more pigmentation your skin has, the more melanin there is. And hence, the darker the person's skin, the less vitamin D they produce. Now going on to this chart, you can see elderly people tested for less vitamin D in their blood than the younger people when they were exposed to sunlight. And this is because elderly people have drier skin, and so they produce less of the 7-DHC oil on their skin, which is required for the vitamin D synthesis. So much like dark-skinned people, the elderly also have a vitamin D deficiency. Many would argue against this and say the minorities are just poorer than white people, and that's why the difference in the death rates. However, this chart was taken from the British Medical Journal, and it shows the age of death of doctors that are white versus those that are of minority groups, like Black Africans or South Asians. In looking at this age range of death, you notice the whites range between 83 years old and 107 years old, the average being 87.9 years old when they died, while doctors who are considered part of the minority ethnic groups range between 46 years old and 72 years old, the average age being 62 years old, which is 25 years younger than white doctors. While many would go on to claim socioeconomical deprivation and racism, the people on this graph are actually getting paid about the same amount of money, except that the whites were retired and the minorities are not because they didn't reach that age of retirement yet. So these are all people with really good salaries, living probably in high middle class areas and living a relatively good lifestyle. So this would be more of a biological issue, not a sociological issue. Now this chart goes into why obese people are vitamin D deficient. You have a control group and you have an obese group. And in each one of these groups, the blue bar shows the levels of vitamin D in the person's body before they were exposed to UV light. And you can see in both groups, before they were exposed, have very low levels of vitamin D, or in other words, they're very vitamin D deficient. Now the recommendation is over 40 nanomoles per liter, and the control group is under 10. Now after 24 hours of exposure to UV light, you can see that their level spikes up to really good levels. However, for an obese person, you can see that the level is still deficient even after UV exposure. This is because the oil gets trapped in the fat cells, so the vitamin D goes to the fat cells and stays there without being available for metabolic use or for immunity. So it's predictable that obese people would be more affected by COVID-19 than thinner people, since they aren't getting the vitamin D that thinner people are getting from the sun. Now this graph shows a survey of 818 subjects who are white patients, and you can see that the median of their vitamin D levels is 18, which is significantly lower than recommended levels. So that means that 50% of this group was extremely deficient because they were even below the 18. And you can see from this chart that only about 10% are actually above the recommended level of vitamin D. Now that's bad, but now we're going to take a look at the Asian ethnic group. We have a subject count of over 1,500 people, and we can see that over 50% of them are less than 9. That's half of what the white ethnic group's median number was. Now this chart is showing the percent of blood level of vitamin D in the Israeli population before COVID-19. And you can see that over half of them are deficient below 20, and they get quite a bit of sun there. And only about 15% had over the recommended level of 40. Now this slide is actually a collection of data from a bunch of patients in a hospital in Galilee. And they were able to take data from critically ill patients' charts back a year before they got sick with COVID. And as you can see, they were critically deficient in their vitamin D levels before they ever got hit with COVID. Now, if you were going to ask yourself where you wanted to be on this chart, where would it be? Would you want to be in the left side? Or would you want to be on the right side? I would probably venture to say on the right side, because as you can see, not one person was over 30 on this chart on their levels of vitamin D. So it's obvious from the statistics that vitamin D is a huge player in your immunity against disease. But the question is how and why? First, we have to dive into the synthesis of vitamin D and how it's produced. First, you can see that the ultraviolet rays hit this 7-DHC on the skin, and it breaks down into cholecalciferol, which is another name for vitamin D. The liver then breaks it down into the bloodstream over a course of many days to a molecule we call 25-OH-VIT-D. Then when it's needed, it's taken to targeted cells, which are called cells of immunity, and then it's converted into 125, which is the active ingredient called calcitriol, where it's used to fight off infections and disease. So without vitamin D, the immunity cells cannot work, and when vitamin D is spent in the immunity cell, then it's no longer there and it needs to be replenished. And when people are deficient, they have no reserves. So we can see that vitamin D is needed to strengthen immunity. But how do we get it? The vitamin D level that you're observing in this chart and in the previous charts is the 25 level that's in the blood after the liver has put it into the bloodstream. It's activated, but it's not in the immunity cell yet. remember that it's a slow process that takes many days to get it into the bloodstream. And in this chart, you can see people taking vitamin D orally, and you can see that it takes many days for their vitamin D level to get up to recommended ranges. So in summary, on this chart, it takes about 21 days to get their vitamin D up to par. This is representative of your standard supplement, which work over a long period of time. However, if you're already sick, how do you get your vitamin D levels up quickly? This chart shows that if you need to get your vitamin D up quickly, you can take the activated version of vitamin D called calcifediol. And as you can see on this chart, it can spike your vitamin D level up to recommended levels within just 2 hours. And keep this in mind that this was known before the pandemic ever hit. But how effective is vitamin D against the pandemic? So here you have two groups that are in the hospital affected by COVID. And you can see one of them is a control group and the other one is being treated with the activated version of vitamin D. Of the 26 people that were treated with really high quality care, about half of them still had to go in the ICU. However, in the group on the left, you can see that after they were treated with vitamin D, only one of them needed intensive care. However, our medical experts ignored this data because they said it was not a large enough group that was tested. But the truth is that larger studies are needed only to identify the small discrepancies among those that were treated and those that were not. When your discrepancies are so big, then really it doesn't matter whether it's a really large group or whether it's a really small group. So take this example. If you wanted to see whether survival was possible when chucking 10,000 people out of a helicopter and you decided to test only 10 of them and they all died, the conclusions would be very crystal clear and you wouldn't need to test all 10,000. Now furthermore, immunizations mimic infections. So when you take an immunization or a vaccine, your body has to fight it off. And in doing so, it actually drops the level of vitamin D in your body. So each time someone gets an immunization, they're spending their already deficient vitamin D in fighting it. So in summary, I have 3 takeaways. If you're elderly, obese, or have somewhat dark skin, you should be taking vitamin D supplements like cod liver oil, or you should eat fish twice a day. This will maintain your vitamin D levels, and you'll have to continue to take those supplements and eat that fish regularly to keep those levels high, so that you always have a reserve. Now 2, if you're young, especially if you're white, get out in the sun more, because that can actually give you a lot of vitamin D. And 3, if you're worried about your vitamin D deficiency, you can buy a test kit on Amazon or have your doctor test you for vitamin D. And if you can attempt to get your hands on calcifediol, that would be really nice in a time of crisis. So there you go. I hope you found value in this video. If you did, please hit that subscribe button as I reverse engineer things every week to help you on your pathway to happiness and success. So with that, I'll see you guys next time.